There's a specific image that people have of the modern civil rights era in the United States between the 1950s and 1960s. And that image particularly pertains to the Southern movement, where Jim Crow was so entrenched. This specific image entails symbols and a timeline of narrative, including bus boycotts, sit-in protests, freedom rides in the South, voter registration drives throughout the South, marches, in addition to a litany of instances of racial violence, all taking place within the South. Over the past 20 years, scholarship on the civil rights movement has been rapidly expanding, geographically to include the North as well as the South, as a locus of civil rights activism and racial struggle in America during the middle of the 20th century. In the Michael Farmer case from 1957, in which 7 young Black and Latinx men were convicted of murdering a white boy, offers a focal point on which to study the civil rights movement as it takes place in New York City. This story has to do with a struggle over territory in Washington Heights among rival gangs in the 1950s. On a sweltering summer night in 1957, young Michael Farmer, only 14 years old, along with his friend Roger McShane, snuck into a public pool in Washington Heights. The facility had been closed since 7 o'clock. This is now well into 11 p.m. Soon after Farmer and McShane snuck into this closed public facility, they were quickly surrounded by a dominant youth gang in Washington Heights called the Egyptian Kings. The gang surrounded Farmer and McShane and beat them until they were on the ground, kicking them and punching them. They sliced both of them with knives and struck one with a dog chain. One was even assaulted with a brandished machete. Although McShane and Farmer were able to escape this assault, Farmer in particular was so badly beaten that when he was delivered to a local hospital, he was pronounced dead on sight, losing consciousness 2 hours before even arriving. A well-publicized trial of the gang members who assaulted both McShane and Farmer ensued, and this trial specifically, a well-publicized trial of the gang members who assaulted McShane and Farmer ensued. And this trial specifically shines a spotlight on civil rights racial struggles in New York City during the 1950s and 1960s, a period generally known as the Civil Rights Era. So 3 specific questions will structure our lecture for today. Number 1, what did the civil rights movement look like in New York City? 2, what role did cities play in the pursuit of Black freedom during this era? And then finally, how did media and politicians help provoke this exodus of white residents from urban centers, now known as white flight? Some key terms we'll be focusing in on are, of course, Michael Farmer, this process of white flight, the Moynihan Report from 1965, the Kerner Commission from 1968, Stokely Carmichael, and then finally, COINTELPRO. If you have ever seen the musical West Side Story from 1961, then you know a little something about the Michael Farmer case. West Side Story is a modern-day Romeo and Juliet narrative set in New York City in the 1950s, in which rival gangs battle out over turf. And the animosity among these gangs, these racialized gangs, provide a foil for a much deeper romantic narrative between 2 representatives of those social groups. And this musical represented some of the real social realities in play in New York City in the 1950s and 1960s. The Egyptian Kings who assaulted McShane and Farmer were among roughly 120 youth gangs, totaling about 8,000 members in New York City during 1957. The Egyptian Kings specifically were a youth group predominantly composed of Puerto Ricans and African American youth. But at the same time, several Caucasian youth gangs also circulated throughout the city. And this focus on youth gangs or youth subculture provides a specific lens in which to read racial violence and racial animosity in New York City during the 1950s and 1960s. Since the mid-1940s, middle-class and white wealthy residents had been fleeing Manhattan for the suburbs, driven in part by the fears that minorities were now taking over. White flight, as it came to be known, occurred so suddenly that neighborhoods seemed to transform overnight. Poor, working-class residents who were left behind scrambled to claim new territories as their own. Washington Heights, where Farmer was murdered, had historically been an Irish and Jewish neighborhood. However, by the 1950s, more and more Hispanic and African American residents began to move into this neighborhood. Despite laws banning segregation in New York City, many Caucasian gang members formed as a response to this influx of non-white people into the neighborhood. Caucasian gang members, for example, routinely guarded and prevented people of color from using public facilities, like the pool where Michael Farmer was murdered. And so, in the summer of 1957, many of these racial tensions exploded over the access to a public pool facility in Washington Heights. In the Farmer case, however, both the press and Mayor Wagner, who was presiding at the time, were reluctant to recognize many of these racial tensions. In the eyes of many Americans, New York City wasn't a place where segregation was a real thing, but in practice, it was. And this points to another distinction between de jure and de facto racism. Just because there are not the same kind of Jim Crow laws on the books in New York City in the 1950s doesn't mean there isn't the same kind of racism that there was in Jim Crow South. In 1957, both the media and politicians failed to recognize and to address the possibility of race and ethnicity having something to do with the murder of Michael Farmer. And they failed to recognize the differences between black and white and Hispanic experiences and perspectives in a city that would soon be overwhelmed with racial struggle in the 1960s. In its broader outlines, the Michael Farmer case recalls the turmoil of the years after World War II in American cities, when conflicts over race and housing moved to the center of local political debate. This was a time when racist fears combined with the fear of losing hard-earned houses and home ownership and property. In such situations, white resistance to integration took the form of attacks orchestrated by entire communities. In Manhattan, where renters vastly outnumber property owners, the lure of the suburbs beckoned, and most white people had no economic incentive to resist integration in the name of preserving property values. Instead, they moved to the suburbs. So this process of what has come to be known as white flight refers to this mass exodus of white middle-class residents from urban centers out to the suburbs, following both jobs and the incentives provided through New Deal programs like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which provided very reasonable mortgage rates for white suburban residents. This not only meant a residential exodus, but also a corporate exodus, and an exodus of corporate tax revenue as well, leaving city coffers depleted by the 1960s. By 1965, middle-class residents and the corporations that had built up overbuilt metropolises like New York were now going to the suburbs. And if they weren't moving to adjacent suburbs in Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey, they were moving internationally to escape restrictive labor laws and to secure cheaper operating costs. By the 1960s, cities like New York were in a precarious situation, unable to sustain the systems of transportation and urban services that were built up during the first half of the 20th century. And minorities, particularly African American minorities, as well as Afro-Caribbean and Latinx immigrants, were trapped in a city that was unable to provide for its populace. These minorities were excluded from the New Deal benefits that engendered white flight in the first place, that drew white residents out to the suburbs to begin with. And so poverty and housing becomes the political platform of the civil rights movement in the North, in urban centers like New York. And this is reflected in the political debates of that time as well. In New York City and elsewhere, black candidates ran on platforms that included calls for full employment, an end to police brutality and housing discrimination, and more schools and hospitals and libraries in black areas. But the city responded in saying, listen, we don't have much money to give out, and when we do give out money, we're going to give it out to purposes that are going to reinvest economically in our urban centers, like giving out tax abatements for corporations to come back in New York City. Through the 1960s, 1970s, New York's municipal government issued a series of austerity measures which essentially excluded communities of color from the urban fabric. By the end of the 1960s, riots broke out in urban centers across the country. Underpinning many of these riots and uprisings were, of course, unemployment, police brutality, discrimination, and exclusion from basic urban services that people for the past 3 decades had so relied on. The urban violence of the 1960s left more than 250 people dead, with more than 10,000 people injured, and more than 60,000 people arrested. Fire destroyed neighborhoods, leaving countless people homeless. Subsequent studies of these urban uprisings showed that participants in the violence were mostly young, northern-born black men who were better educated than their contemporaries but had been confined to low-end jobs and were unemployed and suffered unprecedented amounts of police brutality. In fact, in almost every instance of these urban uprisings begins with an incidence of police brutality. In 1967, the Congress of Racial Equality president, Floyd McKissick, claimed that black people were finally beginning to fight back against white supremacy. He said, "The cup is running over in the ghetto, and it's inevitable that violence will occur." Martin Luther King agreed with McKissick, saying in 1967, every single breakout had been caused by gross unemployment, particularly among young people. Both McKissick and King urged the political establishment, specifically President Johnson, to set up an agency that shall provide a job for every person who needs work, young and old, white and black, despite their political differences. In response to these claims, President Johnson called for 2 commissions to study the impact of this violence and some of the root causes for this unprecedented series of uprisings in urban centers. The first is, of course, the Moynihan Report from 1965, written primarily by the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, later New York State Senator. In this report, Moynihan claimed that these uprisings were tied to the conditions of black families in the 1960s, in which he claimed, quote, a tangle of pathology that poorly prepared blacks, and especially black men, for useful citizenship was behind a lot of this black poverty, but also the animus behind these racial uprisings. Of course, in retrospect, this language appears quite racist and avoids many of the structural issues underpinning black poverty to begin with. Non-white people themselves are not pathological, but the system of governments that excludes systematically non-white people from access to citizenship is itself pathological to democracy. The second commission was called the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, or in short, the Kerner Commission, named after the principal architect of this organization, then the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner. The Kerner Commission found that the violence that had been percolating in urban centers through the 60s can be traced back systematically to the job discrimination and the institutional racism, rather than black power ideology or particular organization of civil rights leaders, or even to the pathology that Moynihan had identified in the report in 1965. The commission, which was highly publicized and republished in various newspapers throughout the country, concluded that, quote, our nation is moving towards 2 societies, divided by race, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And that institutional racism that included a growing racist criminal justice system, as well as political ramifications in response to the civil rights movement, really structured these urban uprisings, and this focal point demonstrated to the country that the civil rights movement wasn't just a Southern phenomenon, but one that stretched across the country and was particularly focused on urban centers like New York. By the end of the 1960s, civil rights activists had really transcended into a new era, including political radicalism as a centerpiece of much of their political platforms. This transformation of the civil rights movement was spearheaded by people like Stokely Carmichael. In 1966, Carmichael was then the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and by then began this move to help unify black activism behind the power through solidarity, independence, and self-determination, as well as taking aggressive measures to secure basic human freedoms and to secure citizenship for black people. Carmichael coined the phrase Black Power that coalesced into a movement behind organizations like the Black Panthers. Black Power rejected nonviolence and coalition buildings as a tradition of civil rights groups and advocated control of black organizations by any means necessary. At around that same time, 1966, the Black Panthers formed as the kind of vanguard for the Black Power movement in California. Organized by people like Huey P. Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, and Bobby Seale, the Black Panthers were a community action organization that necessitated and called for basic human rights for non-white people. The Panthers' 10-point program really crystallizes their mission as a community action organization. As the Panthers summed it up in 1966 and 1972, respectively, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and a people's community control over modern technology. The Panthers, in short, wanted citizenship for non-white people to be extended to non-white people. The Panthers wanted to end what by 1966 was tantamount to a racial caste system in America. Taking a lead from people like Stokely Carmichael and Huey P. Newton, the Black Panthers, even centrist activists like MLK began to shift his efforts from legal rights in the South to more basic economic rights as a foundation of the civil rights movement. Stirred by the turmoil that he saw in American cities and disappointed by the civil rights achievements largely in the South, Martin Luther King began to confront the deep-seated problems of poverty and racism facing many American blacks in northern cities. He spoke out eloquently for a poor people's campaign to fight economic injustice. Ultimately, however, he was cut down in 1968 by an assassin, unable to fulfill many of his plans. In 1967, MLK said, "I think it is necessary for us to realize that we have moved on in the civil rights era to an era of human rights, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power." In short, he says, we have moved into a new era where we call upon to raise the certain basic questions about a whole society. And by that, he's talking about issues that are crystallized in the Michael Farmer case. Issues of basic necessities, issues that entail access to public goods and to public services like swimming pools. Ultimately, however, this transformation of the civil rights movement was undermined by state violence. In 1967, the same year that MLK made those statements, the same year that Stokely Carmichael began to proclaim Black Power, the FBI created a program called COINTELPRO with a specific mission to subvert many of these radical groups. Herbert Hoover instructed COINTELPRO to specifically, quote, neutralize what the FBI called black nationalist hate groups at this time, like the Black Panthers. In September 1968, Herbert Hoover specifically designated the Black Panthers, quote, the greatest threat to internal security in the country. And so throughout the rest of the 1960s and into the 1970s, we see this wave of state repression against black radicals and against civil rights leaders largely. In 1968, Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Chicago Black Panther Party, was murdered by police and FBI. Same thing with Bobby Hutton in California, murdered by Oakland police. 1969, Stokely Carmichael, then the leader of the SNCC, was targeted by COINTELPRO and was forced into exile into Ghana, where he remained for the rest of his life. As Black Power historian Peniel E. Joseph once said, ultimately, Black Power accelerated America's reckoning with its own uncomfortable and often ugly racist past. In the process, it spurred debate over racial progress, citizenship, and democracy that would scandalize and help change America. And part of that change had to do with the inclusion of black candidates into the political process. Throughout the 1970s, we see an efflorescence of black votership and an efflorescence of black political candidates. In 1973, for example, Bobby Seale, the leader of the Black Panther Party, ran for mayor in Oakland, California. Similarly, a wave of black mayors ensued. In 1970, Kenneth A. Gibson was elected mayor in Newark. Same thing with Coleman Young in Detroit, as well as Walter Washington in Washington, D.C. in the late 1970s. So although black radicalism in the cities was ultimately undermined by state repression, there was also the side benefit of including. There was also a bit of structural transformation in the political process by electing many of these black officials. But nonetheless, the history of the civil rights movement in northern cities like New York crystallized many of the foundational components of black radicalism in the 1960s and 1970s. The civil rights era was not circumscribed to the South. The civil rights movement was not circumscribed to the South, but existed in urban centers like Chicago and New York. It may have looked a little different than the media images coming out of the South, but nonetheless, this was the battleground on which black radicalism fought for racial inclusion, an expansion of civil rights and citizenship to non-white people. So in this lecture, we talked about what did the civil rights movement look like in New York City? What role did cities play in the pursuit of black freedom? How did media and politicians help provoke white flight? Some key terms were, of course, Michael Farmer, the process of white flight itself, the Moynihan Report from 1965, the Kerner Commission from 1968, Stokely Carmichael, and of course, COINTELPRO.